When I discovered why, I initially destroyed both of our families, including myself, because Kay was a girl. You see, ever since Janet was a young child, she claimed to despise girls and only like boys, friends, romantic partners, and coworkers. She only surrounded herself with men. When Janet became pregnant, she threw a huge gender reveal party with everything decorated in blue, hoping that it would be a boy. I remember watching her face fall as pink smoke filled the backyard, forcing a smile, but I saw her shoulders slump. For the remainder of her pregnancy, she shared articles about toxic femininity and posted in these boy mom Facebook groups about hoping for a son. After Kaylee was born, things became strange as Janet would dress her only in gray or beige. When Janet announced her second pregnancy last year, she was furious that it was a boy and declared that she would terminate it if it was a girl. She tried every old wives' tale and looked at Chinese gender calendars, but I still can't believe it. At family gatherings, she called her the baby instead of her name, complaining that Kay was too emotional, needy, and dramatic. The child was barely 2 years old, and she would flatly tell everyone she didn't want her. We didn't really interact with Janet for the rest of the pregnancy, and even after she gave birth, the family kept their distance, especially since she had gone away to travel in Europe because giving birth there would be less expensive. However, about 2 months after her baby boy Liam was born, we all got on a FaceTime call with 7 family members. At first, it was sweet, but when the smoke turned blue, she fell to her knees and started crying. Kay waddled over to her to give her a hug and ask what was going on, but she literally pushed her aside, causing her to stumble and scrape her knee against a metal swing. My aunt asked Janet to show him off in his little mommy's man onesie. While she was sleeping, Janet's eyes widened, but she didn't really answer. She just looked down and said, "I don't have her here." Janet then admitted that she had placed Haley for adoption in mid-December when she was 6 months pregnant with Liam, saying that doing so would save money for her trip to Europe because she couldn't handle having 2 children. Everyone in the call was shocked, and my grandmother began clutching her chest 30 seconds later. Her breathing became labored, and she kept gasping Kayle's name. I yelled at Janet that Ryan and I could have taken Kay, even though he did appear extremely uncomfortable. At that point, the call went into chaos, and Janet disconnected. Had to be taken to the emergency room when I got home that night after making sure Grandma was okay. I discovered Ryan in our bedroom deleting pictures from his phone. They were all from 4 years ago, and some of them appeared to be random black and white ultrasound lookalikes. The timeline did coincide with when I was pregnant before I miscarried, so it might have been a coincidence, but I decided to push him a little. I asked him what he was deleting, and he simply got up and went to the bathroom to continue deleting. When he returned, I asked him what he was doing in there, and he simply snapped, telling me that I was paranoid and that the fact that Kaylee was placed for adoption was Janet's business, and that was strange. I hadn't even mentioned Kay. The following day, I specifically told him to look into where Kaylee had her paternity and other documents to help me build this case. As anticipated, the PI worked quickly. He had hotel records, credit card receipts, and recovered deleted messages. The timeline was damning. For years ago, right after my miscarriage, when I was in the hospital, Janet had comforted Ryan. Kaylee was born exactly 9 months later, and the PI even managed to obtain Kaylee's DNA from a toothbrush she used at home. It was a match to Ryan. I remember crying when I learned the news. It took everything I had not to scream and just blow everything up, but instead, I remained composed. A week later, I found myself sitting in my car outside my apartment with the manila envelope containing all of this evidence. My husband would be returning home in an hour, and Janet was coming around to catch up, and I watched them both pull into the parking lot simultaneously. "Hey babe," Ryan said without looking up, "Jane just got here." I placed the envelope on the coffee table and said, "We need to talk, all 3 of us." Janet rolled her eyes. "If this is about Kay again, I told you it's done the same way." Ryan's silver Honda parked next to Janet's red SUV. They got out and exchanged a quick glance before walking toward the building entrance, keeping a careful distance between them. My hands shook as I gripped the envelope tighter. I waited 5 minutes before following them inside the elevator ride, which felt endless. I heard their voices inside our apartment door, casual and relaxed, and when I entered, they both looked up. I spread the contents of the envelope across the table, including hotel receipts, phone records, and the results of the DNA test. Ryan's face turned white as he recognized the papers, and his voice crackled. "I kept my composure 4 years ago when I was in the hospital after losing our baby, and he was with my sister Janet. He actually laughed when I showed him the DNA test results. Oh my God, you hired someone to look into this. Is it pathetic that you gave away Ryan's child without telling him? Ryan stood up, his phone clattering on the floor. This is phony. You're making this up because you're envious that Janet had children, and you couldn't? I took out my phone and pressed play on the recording, and Ryan's voice filled the room as he spoke to Janet about keeping their secret about how I could never know that Kale's real father, Janet, died when she sat down her water glass and cracked it. You recorded us the P. I did this from your own security system, Janet, the one you installed after Liam was born. I put the papers back into neat piles. I've already filed for divorce from Ryan. Our joint accounts are frozen. You'll be getting papers tomorrow. Ryan lunged for the documents, but I pulled them back. Half of our money is gone. Infidelity tends to affect asset division. I turned to Janet. Did Ryan ever give you money for Kay's child support? Janet's face twisted as he said, he couldn't without you knowing. Then, you continued trying for a child, and they turned on each other right away. Ryan accused Janet of trapping him, and Janet screamed about raising his child alone for years, stepped back as they yelled their plot to collapse into mutual blame, and the door of the apartment exploded as my grandmother entered with the help of my aunt and uncle. Although she had just been in the hospital, her eyes were burning with determination, and her voice cut through their argument. We need to talk about this adoption, she said, crossing her arms. I made sure of it, my aunt said, and I recognized the name from the papers you signed. I've worked with the Sunshine Private Adoption Agency before in family court. Janet's smugness faltered. So they have a 6-month reversal window during which biological parents can reclaim children if both parents didn't consent. Did you sign anything? My aunt looked at Ryan, and he shook his head slowly. I didn't even know she was pregnant until after Kaylee was born. It was from a one-night stand, and I picked a family in Oregon specifically so you couldn't find her. Janet spat at me, and they're probably already attached to her. I took out another document, and it seems that you didn't tell them about Kale's behavioral problems, the ones you complained about constantly. Janet grabbed for her phone, and I said quietly, I'll call them right now and tell them to keep her. They're already driving her back. They contacted the agency 2 weeks ago about returning her, and my lawyer has been in contact with them. You have 2 choices. Cooperate with getting Kay back to this family, or I'll remove you from my will entirely. Janet's face turned red, and I realized that you can't threaten me with money. You only wanted boys. Janet turned to Ryan and grabbed his arm, saying, we can fight this together and get custody of our daughter. When I said, I'm handling it, Janet's voice rose to a shriek. My aunt held up her phone, saying, I'm recording this conversation, by the way. Your admission that you gave away Kaylee specifically to hurt your sister will be very interesting in family court. Janet ran for the door, but her uncle blocked her path, and my truck blocked your car. You're not leaving until we resolve this. Janet's phone rang. The adoption agency's number flashed on the screen, and she answered on speaker in an attempt to keep things under control. Missy Janet, the adoptive family has encountered an emergency and is returning early. They will be in town tonight. Where should they bring Kaylee? To my house, Janet said quickly. Actually, my lawyer's voice came over the phone. He'd been in conference, and we've arranged for Kaylee to be brought to her great-grandmother's house. All parties have agreed that this is the safest neutral location. Janet threw her phone against the wall, shattering it into pieces, and Ryan backed away from her as she directed her anger at everyone in the room. You planned this, all of you. She pointed at me. You'll never be her mother. Never, but neither will you, I said quietly. You made that choice when you gave her away to hurt me. My aunt produced a folder, and my aunt said, Ryan, these are parental rights documents. If you sign them, you can avoid prosecution for abandonment and back child support. Ryan's hands trembled as he took the papers and said, prosecution. You knew about Kay for years and offered no support? My aunt clarified that Janet's messages showed that you knew he signed without reading in a desperate attempt to save himself. Janet watched in horror as her last ally broke down, saying, this isn't over. And Janet hissed, I'll get her back. She's mine legally, yes. My aunt agreed. But family court will be very interested in your social media history, including all those posts about not wanting a daughter. The adoption was motivated by your statement that you'd rather sell her than give her to family. So we left the apartment in separate cars and drove to my grandmother's house. Janet attempted to follow, but was stopped for driving too erratically. And by the time she got there, the adopted family's car was already in the driveway. I stood on the porch as they brought Kaylee out. The adoptive mother was smaller than I remembered, wearing a pink coat that I had never seen before, and she clutched a stuffed elephant. The adoptive mother appeared exhausted. and she had been asking for someone named Auntie for weeks, crying every night. My heart broke, and when Janet pushed through the group, Kaylee backed away and hid behind the adoptive father. "I don't know you," Kaylee whispered, and Janet fell to her knees, saying, "I'm your mommy, baby, remember?" But she shook her head and pressed closer to the strangers who had been taking care of her over the past few months. "Auntie," she ran to me, wrapping her little arms around my legs and exclaiming, "Where did mommy go?" The scene descended into chaos as my grandmother escorted everyone inside after Janet's scream of rage sent Kay into tears. Emergency custody papers were prepared, lawyers were called, and the battle for Kay was just getting started. But for the first time in years, I felt hopeful. The emergency custody hearing was set for 3 days later, but those 72 hours turned into a battlefield of family warfare and legal wrangling that tried every last bit of my remaining strength. Janet arrived at my grandmother's house at 6 in the morning after Kaylee arrived. Janet tried to push past him, but he remained firm, so she fled. I was banging on the door, demanding that her daughter's uncle stay overnight, especially two. "Stop this." He opened the door just enough to let her know that any communication needed to go through lawyers. The adoptive family from Oregon had provided sworn statements about Kale's behavioral issues, including constant nightmares, refusing to eat, crying for hours, and asking for Annie. They documented everything, which worked in our favor, but Janet's lawyer was arguing that they were exaggerating. That afternoon, Ryan showed up at my grandmother's house while I was there with Kay. She was coloring quietly at the kitchen table, still withdrawn and confused, when she heard his voice. She looked up in recognition, but remained in her chair. Ryan attempted to approach her, but my grandmother stepped between them, reminding him icily, "You signed away your rights." Ryan objected. "I didn't know what I was signing," and Nathaniel, who had been going over the documents in the living room, joined us. "I want to see my daughter, the daughter you haven't acknowledged for 4 years, Ryan said. And I kept my voice level so as not to upset Kaylee, the person you let Janet give away without saying a word. At least I didn't have to hire a private investigator to stalk my own family. How long were you planning this? How long were you waiting to steal her before I could respond?" Kay said in a small voice, "Why are you all yelling?" And we all froze. I moved to her side, kneeling next to her chair. "Sometimes grown-ups disagree, sweetheart, but you're safe," she said. "We're very similar to his. Are you my daddy?" Hung in the air, and Ryan's mouth opened and closed without making a sound. He turned and left without answering, and Kay watched him go before going back to coloring as if nothing had happened. The following morning, a new crisis arose. Janet had gone to Kale's previous daycare and attempted to get her records, saying she needed them for medical reasons. Fortunately, the daycare director had heard about the situation through local rumors and refused, causing such a scene that security was called. The incident was recorded, and our legal team was notified. Janet's social media history was discovered, including years of posts in boy-mom groups complaining about raising a daughter, including a deleted post from when Kaylee was 18 months old, asking if anyone knew lawyers who handled rehoming. The evidence was damning, but Janet's lawyer would argue that it was taken out of context. The financial pressure began right away when Ryan accessed one of our investment accounts before the freeze occurred, withdrawing $30,000. My lawyer filed motions right away to recover it, but the damage was done, and I had to borrow money from my grandmother to cover legal fees, something that made me sick with shame, even though she insisted. 2 nights prior to the hearing, I was staying at my grandmother's house with Kay when we heard glass breaking. Someone had thrown a rock through the living room window with a note attached, saying, "Stop this or you'll regret it." We called the police, but they were only able to file a report without any proof that it was Janet or Ryan. Kaylee was terrified, clinging to me and asking if the bad people were returning. I dressed Kaylee in the purple dress, which she chose because it was her favorite color, and she held my hand tightly as we entered the courthouse with my entire family standing on either side of us like protective walls. Janet arrived separately, dressed in a conservative suit that I had never seen her wear before, obviously coached by her lawyer to look maternal. The courtroom was smaller than I had anticipated, more like a conference room, and Judge Harrison, a woman in her 60s with keen eyes, went over the stack of documents before her. Kaylee sat on my lap, quietly playing with her stuffed elephant. Her lawyer began by portraying Janet as a struggling single mother who had made a difficult decision for her daughter's benefit, arguing that the adoption had been legal and that my family was interfering with a closed proceeding. He presented Janet as a victim of postpartum depression who deserved a second chance when he stood to present our case. He methodically laid out the evidence, including the social media posts, the recorded conversations about giving Kay away to hurt me, the fact that Ryan hadn't been informed or consulted, and the detailed documentation of Kayle's distress. He played a video that the adoptive mother had taken of Kaylee crying for Andy until she made herself sick. When they showed her Facebook posts, which were jokes, Janet's composure broke down. Despite her lawyer's attempts to calm her down, she insisted that even though everyone vents about their children online, Judge Harrison asked to speak with Kay privately in her chambers with only a child advocate present, and those 20 minutes felt like hours. When they returned, Kay immediately ran to me, burying her face in my shoulder. The judge's preliminary ruling was measured but clear. Judge Harrison's voice was ice. "One more outburst, and I'll hold you in contempt outside the courthouse." Janet confronted us on the steps, saying, "You think you've won. I'll never stop fighting. Never." "Then you'll keep losing," my grandmother said quietly, "because you're fighting for pride, not love." Because of the child's obvious distress, she granted me temporary emergency custody while a thorough investigation was conducted. Janet would have twice-weekly supervised visitation at a court-approved facility. The supervisor observed that Janet appeared more frustrated than concerned about her daughter's suffering. Ryan began dating a new woman from his workplace who had helped him through his divorce. He shared pictures of them on social media, calling her his fresh start. The speed of it was amazing, but it helped our case because the father moves on from his daughter so quickly. 3 weeks into temporary custody, Kay finally began to settle down. She still had nightmares and asked perplexed questions about why she had to visit that woman, but she was eating better and smiling again. I enrolled her in play therapy and drove her twice a week to help her process the trauma. The financial strain was crushing her. Legal bills mounted daily, and Ryan had closed more accounts than we had initially realized, leaving me with a huge debt from our unsuccessful fertility treatments. My family helped out where they could, but everyone was overworked. When Janet showed up at Kayle's therapy appointment demanding to sit in on the session, she sat in the parking lot for the entire hour filming everyone who came and went. Her lawyer dismissed her after she accused him of plotting against us. The second supervised visit was worse than the first. Janet brought Liam in an attempt to force a sibling bond, but Kay was afraid of the baby's cries and hid under the table when the supervisor tried to persuade her to leave. My job suffered from all the court dates and emergency calls. At first, my boss was understanding, but patience were thin. When I had to leave early for the third time in a week because Kayleigh's daycare called about a meltdown, I was placed on unpaid leave until after hearing our story. Dr. Sebastian spent 3 sessions with Kay, watching her play and gently asking questions. His report was thorough, and Kay showed clear signs of attachment disruption and trauma from the failed adoption. She viewed me as her primary attachment figure and showed fear responses when discussing Janet. The financial pressure finally broke me, and I sat at my grandmother's kitchen table, surrounded by bills, sobbing. Janet's new lawyer filed a motion claiming that I was alienating Kay from her mother and demanded a psychological evaluation of my suitability as a guardian. The evaluation would cost thousands of dollars. My own sister for a child who woke up screaming every night. "We'll figure it out," my grandmother said firmly, writing another check I knew she couldn't afford. Family takes care of family. Janet's third supervised visit never happened. She arrived drunk, stumbling and slurring her words, and the supervisor denied her entry, documenting the incident. Her second lawyer dropped her the following day. For weeks before the final hearing, Ryan reappeared with a new plan. He filed a motion to revoke his signed rights, claiming he'd been emotionally manipulated and wanted joint custody with me, cutting Janet out completely. His filing included a declaration that Janet had been an unfit mother from the start, and the betrayal was heartbreaking, even for them. The therapist testified that removing Kay from my care now would cause severe psychological damage. 2 weeks prior to the final hearing, I found Kay cutting her own hair with safety scissors. When I asked why, she said she wanted to look like a boy so her first mommy would love her. I held her while she sobbed, my heart breaking into pieces. I wasn't sure we'd ever fit back together. Kayle's therapy sessions revealed heartbreaking details about being left with strangers and being told I didn't want her anymore. The day before the final hearing, I sat in my lawyer's office exhausted beyond measure because Nathaniel reviewed our case one last time. The evidence was overwhelming that Janet had abandoned her, and that Ryan had caused psychological harm to Kay. Her last-minute involvement appeared to be a desperate attempt to gain control, but family court was unpredictable. So whatever happened tomorrow, Nathaniel said, you've given that little girl more love and stability in 3 months than she'd had in years. That matters. That night, as I tucked Kaylee into bed at my grandmother's house, she looked up at me with those serious eyes. Auntie, will you be my mommy forever? I sat next to her bed and watched her breathe, preparing for the battle that would decide our futures. Tomorrow would bring either the family I'd always dreamed of or the loss of another child I loved, and there was no middle ground left. The final hearing came on a cold Thursday morning. I dressed Kaylee in her favorite purple sweater and braided her choppy hair as best I could, and she clutched my hand as we entered the courthouse, with my family forming a protective circle around us. Janet arrived 20 minutes late, disheveled and alone. Her most recent attorney had withdrawn from the case after her arrest, leaving her to represent herself. She was wearing the same rumpled suit from the preliminary hearing, with coffee stains visible on the sleeve. Ryan sat on the other side of the judge. Harrison entered the courtroom with his new lawyer, a well-dressed woman who had apparently persuaded him that he still had parental rights despite signing them away. He avoided eye contact with everyone and was absorbed in his phone. Harrison addressed the elephant in the room, which was Janet's arrest for threatening court officials. Janet attempted to explain it away as stress, but the judge interrupted her, noting that it showed poor judgment and impulse control. Nathaniel methodically presented our case, presenting the psychological evaluations that showed Kayle's attachment to me, the documented evidence of Janet giving her daughter away despite Janet's inability to connect with her daughter, and the financial records that showed that I spent all of my savings to support Kay, while Janet hadn't contributed a dime since the adoption. When Sebastian took the stand, he described Kayle's trauma in clinical terms that made my chest hurt. He said that the abandonment had caused her to feel deeply insecure and that removing her now would cause irreversible psychological harm because she thought she had been thrown away for being wrong. Her questions were accusatory and rambling, and she claimed that he had been paid off and that the entire system had been rigged against her. Harrison had to warn her twice about her behavior in the courtroom. Ryan's lawyer contended that her client had been tricked into signing away his rights, portraying him as a victim of two cunning women who conveniently ignored his affair and abandonment. Ryan testified that he wanted to be involved in Kayle's life now that he understood she was his daughter. Tell them you want to come home with mommy, she begged, lowering herself to her knees and grabbing Kayle's shoulders. Tell them you love me, she said, pulling away against my legs. You're not my mommy. You gave me away. The court officer stepped in, but the damage was done. Kaylee spent the remainder of the hearing in my lap, her face buried in my shoulder, occasionally peeking out to make sure Janet wasn't approaching. When the hearing resumed, Judge Harrison called Kay to her chambers voluntarily, even giving the judge a small smile. They were gone for half an hour. When they returned, the judge's face was grim. She acknowledged Janet and Kay's biological relationship, but she went on, biology alone didn't make a parent. Janet had abandoned her child out of gender preference and spite. She'd shown no genuine interest in Kayle's well-being, only in winning a battle regarding Ryan. The judge noted his complete absence from Kayle's life for 4 years. His sudden interest coincided suspiciously with his divorce proceedings and appeared more about control than genuine paternal concern. His signed relinquishment of rights was legal and binding. The judge granted me full legal custody with no visitation. Rights for Janet pending completion of parenting classes, anger management, and psychological evaluation. Ryan's petition was denied entirely. The adoption process could begin immediately. Janet shot to her feet. You can't do this. She's mine. I gave birth to her. And then you gave her away, Judge. Harrison replied. This court's primary concern is Kayle's well-being, not your regrets. Security approached Janet as she began to move on the bench toward me, but her face twisted in anger, saying, this isn't over. I'll appeal. I'll fight this until you're bankrupt. Ryan slipped out during the chaos, not even looking at the daughter he'd claimed to want, and gathered her papers with obvious disgust outside the courthouse. My family gathered around us in a group hug, and Kaylee, still confused, managed a tiny smile as she saw the celebration. That evening, Janet showed up at my grandmother's house with Liam on her hip. She had been drinking, and when we didn't answer, she pounded on the door, demanding to see her daughter, and when we didn't answer, she began yelling accusations at the windows, and neighbors called the police. I watched from as officers led her away. My grandmother was holding Liam. After several incidents, the adoption proceeded slowly, with background checks, home visits, and court appearances. 3 months into the process, Ryan sent a single email saying, "I'm moving to Seattle for work. I won't contest the adoption. Tell her just to take care of her." Jaylee's appeals went unanswered, and her behavior at hearings continued to deteriorate. Her parents reported that she had shown up hammered, demanding money, claiming we had stolen her life. The adoption was finalized on a Tuesday, and Kaylee wore a new purple dress and held a stuffed elephant that the judge had given her. When I asked her if she wanted to be my daughter, she nodded solemnly and said yes, in a clear voice that evening as I tucked her into bed in what was now her room. She also asked if Janet would try to take her away again, so I smoothed her hair, which was still growing out unevenly, and promised to keep her safe. 6 months later, at a school function, I met David, whose daughter was in Kale's class. He was widowed and understood complex family dynamics. We talked while our girls were playing on the swings. Janet sent a letter through her lawyer asking for a picture of Kay, but we decided against it after talking to Kay's therapist, who said that Kay was finally feeling secure contact, which could undo months of progress. I went back to work, part-time after Kaylee adapted to school and money was tight, but we managed. My grandmother helped with after-school care, and their bond grew stronger every day. When I ran into Ryan's mother at the grocery store a year after the adoption, she cried and hugged me, saying that she was glad Kay had me. She tried to talk to Ryan about seeing his daughter, but he cut off contact, saying, "It's easier this way." She whispered. Janet stabilized eventually, according to my aunt, got sober, found work, and saw Liam on weekends under supervision. She never stopped claiming that we'd stolen Kay, but the fight had gone out of her, so David and I took things slowly. He understood that Kay came first. Their relationship developed naturally. He taught her how to ride a bike. She showed him her drawings, and when he proposed 2 years later, he asked Kale's permission. The wedding was small, with only Kaylee as my maid of honor, beaming in a purple dress that she chose herself. At the reception, she whispered, "Now I have a real daddy too." After tucking her in that night, I stood in her doorway and watched her sleep. The journey had been nothing like I had anticipated when Ryan and I battled infertility, but this child, who had been abandoned by the people who should have loved her the most, had become my entire universe. In the end, Janet had been correct about one thing. Although I would never be Kale's biological mother, I was her mother in every way that mattered. Kaylee still had nightmares occasionally and continued to attend monthly therapy sessions. The adoption hadn't healed her trauma, but she laughed now.